Troisième temps de cette matinée. Pardon, vas-y. Bon, pardon pour ce petit problème technique. Troisième temps de cette matinée, donc nous allons parler ensemble du futur, des perspectives futures nouvelles, ouvertes et déjà testées en fait par les serious games. Et donc pour parler de ce thème, j'ai à nouveau le plaisir d'avoir autour de moi un duo totalement paritaire. Merci encore Patrick. À ma droite, Sarah Grand-Clement et à ma gauche, James Black. You understand French or... Ouais, c'est bon. Ok, thank you. Tous les deux, alors je vais faire court, vous êtes aussi un duo professionnel puisque vous travaillez tous les deux à la Rand Corporation Europe. Hein. Bon, je ne présente pas la Rand, tout le monde connaît pour le coup. Vous êtes analystes, vous êtes des spécialistes des questions de défense, des questions d'antiterrorisme. Vous travaillez aussi, je crois, sur le chimique, non, il me semble, hein, aussi, vous, Sarah. Voilà, nouvelles technologies, les questions migratoires également. Donc vous avez un champ assez large, vous êtes basé à Londres, hein, à Cambridge, pardon, excusez-moi, à Cambridge. Et en fait, peut-être pour introduire cette table ronde, je voudrais rappeler quelque chose, c'est que la Rand est à l'origine, enfin, est l'une des organisations, des associations qui s'est intéressée le plus tôt au serious game. Et juste une anecdote, je crois, et vous me le confirmerez, que c'est à l'issue d'un travail fait par la Rand que les Américains et les Soviétiques ont mis en place leur fameuse hotline au début des années 60, je crois que c'est 61, mais j'ai un doute, vous nous confirmerez. Voilà quel a été en fait le premier effet concret des jeux travaillés avec les spécialistes de la Rand et les spécialistes, bien sûr, de stratégie américaine. Vous allez nous parler aujourd'hui donc du futur, des perspectives. Et il y a au moins un exemple concret aujourd'hui dans l'actualité qui peut être intéressant pour les serious games. On parle aujourd'hui de coronavirus. Voilà un exemple, par exemple, sur lequel vous pouvez travailler, les problématiques de pandémie. Également, je pense au changement climatique. Je pense notamment à ce qui s'est passé à la Nouvelle-Orléans il y a quelques années. Typiquement, c'est les sujets pour lesquels vous travaillez aujourd'hui. Je vous laisse la parole pour, je sais pas, comme vous voulez, un duo, une dizaine de minutes chacun. Si vous voulez, Sarah, introduire, commencer, c'est à vous.
Oui, merci. Merci pour cette introduction. En fait, la présentation va être en anglais, donc, mais n'hésitez pas à nous poser des questions en français ou venir nous parler en français après. So just switching over to English. So James and I, just checking the clicker, yes. We will be discussing the future of gaming for policy, and in particular discussing challenges that gaming will be facing in the future, and is currently also facing. Although you kindly said that Ron doesn't need an introduction, I'll give one anyway, because I'm aware that maybe not everyone is familiar with RAND Europe. Although you may know RAND Corporation, which we are part of. So RAND Corporation is headquartered in Santa Monica in the US, and obviously a big name within the gaming community. But we are part of the European side of the RAND Corporation, so based in Cambridge and Brussels. We were initially established in the early 90s in the Netherlands, but our core operations currently are in Cambridge in the UK. And we currently have over 100 of employees working in a range of different policy areas. So James and I work predominantly on defense and security, but we also cover education, social policy, criminal justice, and many others. And we also work across using a range of methodologies. Our organization is very diverse, so we have a number of different nationalities. We also work across a range of different disciplines, and this allows us to be able to work in very different policy areas that touch many different countries. So as mentioned, RAND Corporation is obviously quite famous in the gaming community. It's had a history in designing games. It started developing this area of expertise from the 1950s. And it's played a prominent role in applying gaming to help policymakers address real-world defense issues. And as mentioned, possibly the most famous outcome was of a war game led by Rand was the one that resulted in that very famous, USSR, hotline, the famous red telephone, and that basically a game showed that it was apparent that to avoid a crisis between the two powers, you had to have a direct line of communication, and that is how it came about. And fast forwarding a few years, Rand continues to design games for a wide variety of clients and contexts. And games continue to have relevance in thinking through tough and sometimes very thorny and multifaceted issues that go beyond what obviously was discussed previously during the Cold War. And games can be used to help policymakers in multiple ways and for a wide variety of purposes. So I'll just run through a few of the aspects that gaming can help with, although a few have been mentioned already in the previous presentations. So first of all, games are an analytical tool, so they don't predict one certain future. They help you think about possible futures. And as an analytical tool, it can help frame and explore a particular policy problem or scenario. So for example, the recent crisis with Iran could be a perfect setting for a war game. Games are also a safe environment that players can use to think through issues. And when I mention players, I'm not only talking about policymakers, but also defense personnel or members of third sector and private organizations. And in this kind of safe environment, people can really stress test different possible strategies or courses of action. Gaming can also be used as a technique for exploring logic, creativity, and assumptions underpinning policy or decision-making to ensure that policymakers are adapted, or policy decisions are adapted to the reality and the complexity of reality that is happening on the ground, and the multi-stakeholder aspect of decisions and strategy implementation. And related to that, games also act as a vehicle to bring together different communities of interest. So this involves bringing different voices, perspectives, backgrounds, and bringing all these people together on a given issue. And this really replicates the reality of a world because the world includes these different stakeholders when taking decisions or playing out issues. And this will allow also a more enriched experience and means that the result of the game is most likely to replicate or to address actual real-world problems. And this also permits an analysis and an outcome that may not be easily replicable through different means, such as discussion groups. And finally, games are interactive, so they allow people to kind of educate and train, enabling really participants to embed themselves in their roles and engage more fulsomely with the issue at hand, providing a more nuanced understanding of a particular issue. And at Rand Europe, we conduct a variety of different games which encompasses all of these aspects I've just mentioned. And I'll just run through a few that we currently do so you get a better understanding. So for example, we run strategic exercises for senior decision makers. And we currently have a 3-year contract with the UK Royal College of Defence Studies, where we run bi-yearly strategic exercises, which thoroughly tests cohorts of students on how to deal with crises. So this can range from a resurgence of conflict in the Balkans or exacerbating tensions which already exist in the Middle East, and really placing them in the crux of the issue and enable them to kind of assess the events under stress, enabling them to kind of think through about how they would respond to them while taking into account factors which perhaps as defense personnel they've never been confronted to. So how to deal with the media, how to deal with public opinion, because in real life, you're not just making strategic moves or tactical moves, you have to think about the wider context. And this really pushes them to thinking on how to collaborate and how to cooperate to achieve a resolution of the issue, taking into account international organizations. So how would you engage with the UN? How would you engage with the EU? We also conduct regional focused games to understand emerging threats and opportunities. So one game which we've recently led was gaming threats to international cooperation and security in the Arctic. So currently the Arctic is quite calm, there's not much attention, but we kind of thought, okay, what would happen in 2025? And we brought together countries with stakes in the Arctic, so Denmark, Canada, US, China, Russia. But then we also included other kind of non-national aspects, so indigenous communities who live in Nordic countries, economic interests from shipping companies, because in reality, these will all be involved in any conversation that happens in the Arctic. We also run what are called tabletop exercises, or TTX, which allows us to explore future scenarios or kind of emergency situations. And this is a technique that we used with the European Defence Agency, where we were commissioned to support the EDA's capability development plan to 2035. And this was a multi-day TTX where we had member state representatives and we led them through a range of different scenarios, really testing them on how to think about the future and future technologies that might exist. And this allowed us to present the EDA with a kind of robust input within the CDP. And as you may have noticed, all of these examples have been very focused on defense-specific kind of scenarios, as are traditional serious games. However, we've started to go beyond that as an organization, and we've started to apply gaming techniques to non-defense sectors. And one such example was TTX that was run as part of a project for the government of Estonia. And this was to help them in the analysis of new and emerging technologies and how these could be used to help kind of understand their impact on cybercrime, and also how they could help kind of prevent cybercrime from happening. So this is just a brief overview of what we've done so far, but I'll just hand over now to James to talk about the future of gaming more generally, along with a clicker.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm aware Matthew began as an American by thanking you for your actions 300 years ago. I'm aware that as a Brit, I was the enemy of both parties at that point, so I can only apologise, which I think is probably the British thing to do in general, particularly, I think, with the political events coming up this week for the UK. So I'm going to kind of follow up on what Sarah's been talking about by talking a little bit about some of the kind of future issues for gaming writ large, and for this community of which everyone in this room is automatically a part. And I think it's clear, if you go and look at Matthew's book, that there's obviously a very long history of interest in this topic. There's been repeated kind of steps forward and steps backward in terms of the level of interest from governments and from policymakers, and also in the amount of effort and investment that has been poured into developing and applying gaming methodologies. But it's certainly clear that gaming has an enduring utility. At the same time, the kind of wider decision-making context is changing. So the way, the types of decisions that governments and militaries and other organizations are having to make are changing. The scenarios they are facing are changing. The levers of power that they can use are changing. And also their collaborators, their allies, their partners, their adversaries are all continuing to evolve. And we clearly have some new emerging issues, such as, say, climate change has been mentioned, which wasn't a major issue or a major priority if you go back 20, 30, 50 years in the development of gaming, but clearly is becoming an important contextual feature at the very least. So with this kind of changing decision-making context, gaming itself needs to continue to evolve to stay relevant, and to continue to deliver the kind of analysis and the outputs and the education and the training and so on that it can do when done right. At the same time, there are a range of new technologies that are coming in. We've already had a question about to Matthew about how do you game or model or simulate a future technology or a future capability, future platform. That is clearly one issue. How does gaming move with increasing confidence into new domains? It's obviously you already have lots of games that look at cyber or look at space, beginning to look at the information environment. But that's obviously, an area that's continuing to mature. There's also a question about how does technology affect gaming? So how do new technologies, new techniques enable new methodologies, or equally introduce new risks and new challenges that the gaming community have to be aware of, particularly when it comes to communicating what games and models can and cannot be used for. So just to give a kind of brief sense of some examples. So this is just a simple table taken from a recent study by some of our US colleagues from RAND. You can find it on the website. This was a short study they did not so short study they did for the US Marine Corps, helping understand how different countries are approaching gaming, particularly in a defense context, including France, including the UK, including many European and NATO countries. And what they also wanted to look at was how has commercial gaming evolved over time, and how have some of the technologies and some of the areas of interest in the wider kind of commercial gaming space, and nowadays including video games, which we talked about earlier, how have they evolved and brought new ideas into the serious games environment. And I think there's a number of examples here of how technology has moved over time, and obviously we've moved away from purely relying on kind of Kriegspiel type setups or tabletop board game setups, obviously moving now towards an era where computer-based modeling is much, much simpler and low cost than it used to be. There are still some challenges, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But there are a lot of opportunities that technology provides. You've obviously got lots of technologies that enable connectivity, so you can have people in multiple locations playing the same game or contributing in some way. You have nowadays, if you're looking at the kind of latest technology out there, you have virtual reality, augmented reality, lots of interesting ideas out there about how this might be brought together with traditional kind of board games, how you might, for example, be able to have a board game with your various counters and pieces out, you hold up your iPad and you can project certain information onto that, all the way through to the very ambitious ideas for hologram tables and lots of the kind of exciting, sexy things you see in the movies. So this is really driving a lot of change, or at least a consideration about potential new methodologies. At the same time, the generations of people who come in and play games are obviously changing. So some of the ways they approach decision-making continue to evolve. Some of the heuristics, so some of the kind of basic shorthands in their thinking that they apply will be changing. At the same time, I think it's worth noting that many things stay the same. If you go back and you look at the history of gaming, you see that we repeatedly learn, forget, learn, forget, learn, forget the same lessons. So I don't think we should emphasize the degree of change too much. It's important to remember that a lot of the lessons we are learning today are actually the lessons that they already learnt in the 1880s, the 1920s, the 1950s. We just forgot them. So I think that, that point of continuity is an important one as well. And this is a kind of simple graph that shows how interest in different aspects of this problem has changed over time. Purely indicative, obviously, but I think it gives you a flavor. We already had a question about computer-based modeling and how do you perhaps draw in some of the strengths of modeling and simulation technologies and approaches alongside the strengths and the weaknesses of traditional kind of gaming, very reliant on the human factor, on the board game, and on qualitative approaches. And if you look over time, really interest in both of these two communities has waxed and waned over time. So there have been periods of history where there's been a lot of attention paid to qualitative approaches, to embracing the fact that you can't predict the future, that numbers can't tell you everything, and actually what you need is a qualitative discussion in a structured, game-based way around a problem with a bunch of people from different perspectives, and that's where you get the value. Equally, there have been periods where interest has switched, and there's been a real interest in, well, can we actually use new advances in processing, new advances in some of our kind of application of statistics and so on, to better understand the linkages between cause and effect and how different courses of action in a game or a model might play out, and to also use the fact that, as has been mentioned in the question about stochastic kind kind of approaches, the fact that if you're obviously using a computer, you can do this 100 times, you can do it 1,000 times. You can't really ask, 50 one-star or two-star generals to sit in a room and play the same game 100 times. All you can guarantee at the end of that is that the facilitator of the game will not have survived. Clearly this has waxed and waned over time, and there remains a large amount of kind of mutual skepticism, I think, between the gaming community and the modeling community, even though we're both trying to approach ultimately the same problem. And I think it's important that we try and recognize the strengths and the limitations of both. And at least at RAND, where we try and bridge this gap, is recognizing that the strengths of modeling can benefit the kind of weaknesses of gaming, and the strengths of gaming can benefit the weaknesses of modeling. So there are many ways in which modeling tools can enable you to shortcut some of the adjudication, for example, in a game. They can enable you to provide more rigor and understanding of the kind of physics and the mechanics behind why certain courses of actions would have certain consequences. They can be great for visualization. Ultimately, if you can use the latest technologies to bring something to life or to show visually or on a graph or whatever why something happened, why it happened the way it did, that can be a very compelling tool in getting that across to decision makers. At the same time, gaming can be a really useful way of helping you refine and improve your models, or refine and improve your wider approach to simulation.
Your last words?
Yes.
Thank you.
Last words. So I think it's important just to note that these two things should be seen as a symbiosis. So you need research that will inform what you're going to design a game around. You need a game that can help you refine your understanding of the problem, and then you can maybe use a model to feed back into that game, and vice versa. So lots of opportunities for the future.
Thank you, Jeff, for your conclusion. The last words to Sarah. A few words, please,
I'll be very
if you
quick.
have time to have questions.
Yeah, James, you talked for too long. No, just kidding. I was just going to, if you could just click on. Thank you. I was just going to talk that beyond the issues of technologies, there's also just social issues that the gaming community needs to acknowledge and needs to address. So essentially, there's a few challenges obviously existing within the community, and so for example, the fact that gaming is obviously a methodology that can be used beyond defense, so thinking about it in the broader context. So far it's very focused on wargaming, but gaming can be applied as a methodology. It's agnostic of the sector, so it's thinking about it in that sense. And there's also an interest in terms of gaming in the sense that how can we democratize gaming so that a new generation will be interested and will have knowledge of the methodology, essentially avoiding a decline which happened following the Cold War in the US, when people are like, oh, okay, so this issue is solved, Cold War has come to an end, and there was a decline in the knowledge around gaming. And then finally, just how do we ensure relevance of gaming in today's world? So it's linked to the second point. Someone mentioned a question saying, well, there's not really been any big things happening in the gaming community since the Cold War. Yes, that's true. And how do we make sure that gaming continues to have relevance? And we have some answers, and I'll be very brief. If you could click on.
Thank you so much, James and Sarah.
Yeah, but so essentially,
Yes.
Do you want to click on? So there's just a few kind of points, and this just basically, in a few words, says that this one is great to expand basically gaming beyond just the defense community. It's also the importance of encouraging younger people to undertake gaming. So a group of RAND researchers developed a game for young women, teenagers, and that's a great way of bringing a new generation in. And finally, it's just increasing diversity of gaming. Reducing barriers of entry, allowing more young people to participate, allow more women to participate, allow more people from diverse ethnic backgrounds to participate. Because essentially, if you're trying to game real-world problems, you need people who represent the real world to enable good and effective policy decisions. I hope that was brief.
Thank you so much for your very complete presentation and your messages. there were plenty of messages. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut rebondir? Il y a plein de questions qui sont ouvertes. Je vois 2 mains qui se lèvent à peu près au milieu de l'amphithéâtre. Si vous voulez bien passer un micro, merci beaucoup. Il nous reste 5 minutes, donc si vous voulez bien faire une question relativement courte pour que tout le monde puisse poser des questions, merci. Normalement, ça marche, hein? Allez-y, c'est bon.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you both of you for this very interesting presentation. My question is dealing about history. So I'm belonging to the French military historical branch in Vincennes. I'm the chief of history and simulation department. And how might you find about the way of using history to attract and to expand, you know, the subject of wargaming, because it used to be a very popular game in the 70s in UK. I remember I was a teenager at that time. So outdoor wargaming with some soldiers.
Okay.
And do you consider the role of history in that sense?
Okay, thank you.
I think it's very important. I mean, clearly, there's a lot of interest in militaries often in talking about the future because that's the problems they're preparing for. But as any historian will tell you, kind of things don't repeat themselves directly. They repeat themselves first as tragedy and farce. But there are certain kind of richness and contextual lessons that can be drawn by looking at the historical cases. So I mean, I think often, certainly when we design scenarios, for example, we often look at the history of a region, or we look at similar crises that have occurred in different regions, but perhaps might have certain lessons that could be drawn. I think what we don't want to do is to say that, this is how it happened before, therefore it will happen again. So we don't want history to become kind of deterministic, but I think it's really important to grounding any scenario, any game in the real world and its complexity, and also showing people why things are so uncertain. They're very messy. Lots of history is made by mistakes and accidents and confusion and friction and fog and so on. And I think bringing that to gaming is very important, so you don't imply that gaming is a simple kind of probabilistic roll of the dice and that's it. That remembering the human factor from history is key.
Thank you so much. If you want your question, you could ask to Sarah, please, and
All right.
we will be on time.
Hello,
Thank you.
David Kahn, founder of Federal Europe and game designer, Wargamer. I would like to ask a question about the difference between modeling and gaming. In the strategic context, we know that there is a lot of uncertainty about what the opponent will do. And in that sense, I think the modeling is less efficient than the gaming. What's your take on that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, to echo basically what Matthew said before, your game has to apply to your question. So you can't decide, I will do a simulation, and then decide what your question will be. You have to first decide what game you want to play, what answer you want what question you want answered, and basically what policy issue you want addressed, and that will then determine what game you will play. So it's not a matter of saying that this, and exactly what James was trying to get across is that modeling and simulation will not answer every issue, and it should be used within the broader kind of, you shouldn't just use gaming on its own. It comes with a whole package of other kind of methodologies. Like it's not something that will be a standalone thing if you want to use it for policy making. And similarly, modeling and simulation will not address every single issue. It's kind of knowing how to adapt the game that you use to the question that you're asking or the issue that you're kind of gaming.
Peut-être, Patrick, si tu me permets, une dernière question rapide. Le monsieur avec l'écharpe, s'il vous plaît. Voilà. Et puis après, vous aurez la possibilité de parler évidemment avec Sarah et James durant toute la journée. Hein.
Okay. I'm a former teacher from the War College, and I would like to know how you integrate the new aspects of media. I mean, how tweets can influence strategic decisions, and how influence media, because even if you have the best strategy, if you cannot sell it, or if it's presented in a devious way, it annihilates every effect of this strategy. So how do you integrate that in your games?
Very good question. Thank you.
I mean, it's certainly a challenge. I mean, you can quite easily, simulate things like Twitter, and you can simulate BBC News and CNN and so on. So the technology and the methodologies to do that are relatively well known. I think the biggest challenge, at least from my perspective, has always been how do you make sure that media plays the right role in any sort of game? So what you don't want is, doing media stuff can be very exciting. It can be very fun. If you've spent days, poring over a map, trying to come up with some very complex strategy to deal with a different crisis. If somebody then asks you to talk about something on a fake version of BBC News, that's good fun. So you will often see players get slightly distracted by media, or you might see the media come to dominate, so it becomes all about the media rather than the media supporting the strategy. And that's not the direction that we want that to be in. We clearly want the strategy to drive the media and be aware of the media, but not be driven by the media. So that's just something about facilitation, I think, that's important.
You want to tell a word to conclude? No? It's okay? Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, James. They will be with us all day long.